here. Well, the beginning part I can always cut, and the end
Okay.
again. Like YouTube allows to cut from the beginning and from the end. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, so
And this is the seventh one. Yes.
yeah, this
Sorry.
is the seventh. This is our seventh conference on iconography, contemporary iconography, and we were just discussing how we're glad, in spite of this circumstances, how we have been able to come together in through Zoom. You know, otherwise we would have probably not ever met, you know, in real life. But this is a blessing, regardless. So I want to introduce our participants. I have Philip Davydov on what is my left-hand side. I can't make out, I get confused about what's on the right-hand side and what's on the left. On the top row is Philip Davydov, icon instructor and iconographer. On the second row, we have George Kordis, former professor of iconography in the University of Athens and also a world-renowned master iconographer. And next to him, we have Mihai Coman, who is also a professor in Bucharest and also a very, very good iconographer, masterful iconographer. And at the bottom, we have Todor Mitrović, who is a professor in Serbia and also strong iconography in you know in the international scene. Now, we wanted, based on our last conversation, to continue on the theme of line. What is the function of line in Byzantine iconography? And before we start that discussion, I wanted to make a few comments about the development of painting in the 19th century into the 20th century, mainly as it pertains to Impressionism. Impressionism was an interesting development insofar as it took the act of painting outside of the studio, and it availed itself of the contemporary developments on the manufacturing of tube paints and artist colors that were being developed that made it easier for artists to go out and set up their easel and start depicting nature firsthand. And so their attitude towards painting was one that was an empiricist attitude. What I mean by that, it was that they wanted to record the sensation of nature to the eye of the painter. It was recording the optical sensation. According to Monet, one of the prime most impressionists, to do so, what you would do was to become somewhat naive as what you're perceiving, forget about outline, because to him outline was an imposition of the mind on nature, and it was an artificial construct. He wanted to capture whatever nuance of color tone and whatever little shapes he perceived optically manifesting itself as light fluctuated in front of him. So what that produced was a painterly effect that was very much atmospheric, where you do not see any hardened outline. It was an attempt to capture the fleeting phenomenon of light as the main subject of the painting. Now, that brings up to me a very interesting, as I pointed out just now, a very interesting attitude towards line as the imposition of the mind on nature. Now, I guess we could start the conversation with whether or not it is justifiable to think of line as an abstract conceptual imposition of the mind on perceived reality that enables us to order hypostases, entities, in a more clear way that otherwise, would render representation too erratic, too disorderly. What do you think, George?
Well, for me, Father, I think that there is, I would say, a more fundamental question, because I think that we have to ask first why we have to have outline. Why is that? Can we, let's say, abandon, this idea of drawing like that and follow, this naturalistic tradition, because actually that was introduced basically with, Leonardo's painting with the chiaroscuro. He was the first who tried to I would say, to destroy, the outlines and have this, rendering of volume with no outlines. Why we have to keep this tradition? That's I would say, more fundamental question. Why we need to preserve this tradition of outlines? So
yes,
why we need to have lines? Can we abandon this and go in a absolutely different direction and start painting the icons, introducing in iconography, this rendering of just volumes with no outlines? Can we do that? I would say that it's more fundamental. I have an idea, I have an answer to that. I think that the need for line came when the depth in painting, introduced. Since there is no pictorial depth, so the only way to make things, clear between, to discern between different things, we have to introduce different colors and just to enhance the outline. This way, since we don't have volume, we cannot, I would say, create a volume. So through volume to make, things to be distinctive. So because we don't have pictorial depth, everything is on surface. So we have to have outlines to make things clear, for any viewer. So that was the need, I think, that moved, painters towards this direction. And I think that that's a good basis to start thinking of the function of line, because that was the reason, and that's the question, I think.
Actually, you want to say that we have the more fundamental need, which is not having a space or
Yes.
not having a division, the special division between bodies. This is primary. I think this is actually a theological fundament of the way icon is painted. So actually, our iconographer's attitude toward line in the Middle Ages was produced on this basis. I mean, I just wanted to add. I think it makes sense that this is the basic need. Sorry.
Can it be said that what would hold together, let's say, in a painting by you know, in the chiaroscuro tradition or the Impressionist tradition, what would hold it together is atmospheric feels of tone, whereas in the Byzantine tradition, what holds it together is the structure and relationships, interrelationship of line.
Yes, basically the basic difference is that in Western tradition from, you know, Renaissance period on, there is a pictorial space behind the icon, so we can have a development of volume. So we don't need line. We don't need line. Line is useless. We can have volumes, so we can build and make things clear or distinct through volume. So that's okay. If we don't have volume, there is no pictorial space behind the icon, which is in front of the icon in Byzantine tradition. So we cannot develop this. The volume is not, I would say, it's not reachable anymore. We cannot use volume. So we need line. Line is, I would say, a synonym of lack of pictorial space, independent pictorial space.
Or maybe consequence.
Yeah. Introduces a different way of building forms and relating forms with the spectators. So it's an introduction to a different ecclesiology, basically.
But that's I think that's a direction that I want to explore, that function of line. Not only because that, to me, that is the, like you're saying, the one of the main ways by which you are able to create a relationship between the viewer and the pictorial field.
Mm-hmm.
And like you're saying, you are able to not only bring the forms out from the two-dimensional picture plane,
mm-hmm.
but you're also creating relationships between the various forms in that specific field and a relationship with the third party, which is the observer. That,
yeah.
And so how does that happen?
Relationship, it's a more complicated thing. It has to do with the qualities of line. It's more complicated. It's about composition, synthesis. It's a different, I would say, step. It's a step further. But basically, the basic, I would say, function of icon, of line, is that since we have outlines, everything is on surface. There is no depth, there is no volume behind the icon. So that's a beginning of building the relationship between form and viewer.
Okay. Mihai, you have anything to add to this?
I totally agree. It's the line gives a hypostasis to the form. The form cannot exist without the outline. Otherwise, they go together. From as the distance grows, the eye cannot read the forms without the outline.
Yeah.
So it's of huge importance.
Yeah. What about you, Philip?
Yes, I'm totally in. The line allows distinguishing or legibility of every image to be separate. And I wanted also to add one more thing, which I have heard from Alexander Kornaukhov, is such a famous Russian mosaicist. He used to say that in Byzantine art, the object is sacrificed for the sake of the space. So if in this space we require the figure to be smaller, the figure will be smaller because the space requires it. And the line is the boundary, and the line is the membrane between the space and the figure, and which of them is subjective or which of them is objective. So they kind of find out their relationship through the line. So indeed, yes, it's the necessary limit because there are no other ways of demonstrating how the limits are organized.
So once you establish the hypothesis, the clarity of forms and specific characteristics of the beings that you're representing, how then does line enable these individual entities to come alive? How can we, instead of a static, dead, schematic representation, actually make of it a representation that is perceived as full of vitality? I think one of the problems that you find often in the teaching of iconography and in the popularization of iconography is the tracing of prototypes and lack of awareness of vitality of line, or lack of awareness of the living line as contributing to the overall effect of the icon's power. I mean, and living presence. The one thing that I was talking to Philip earlier was the problem of when people encounter iconography, I think part of the problem that arises is the impression that it is a simpler art. It is more accessible because it is not as demanding, because it's not naturalistic. And so then people fall into mannerisms that render the icons dead. I mean, into caricatures of what an icon should be. And so there is no relationship or communion being made between the subject that is being represented and the person, like, who is actually trying to bring that into existence, you know? And so how can I think, and this is I think pressing or important question to address to all of you, because you all have encountered different peoples and different levels when you're teaching iconography. How can you help the student connect with line in that level?
Okay.
So who wants to take, unless Mihai, why don't you
Can I try?
start that?
I have an idea.
Okay.
Maybe it connects, this idea can connect our previous story to your first question. Actually, what was the fundamental, as we said, as we agreed, all of us, what was the fundamental reason for a need for line? Also answers this question with which you started. Is the line the projection of the mind on the painting? Well, it is this way. It is a projection of the mind of the painting, but it's a projection of a specific mind, or we could say an ecclesiastical mind, a projection of ecclesiastical way of thinking to the icon, to the painting surface. I mean, this is what makes lines so specific, and this is what also make image intelligible. It's not in a very specific way. Everything makes image intelligible. Everything is a projection of mind. But this is a projection of a specific way of thinking. So if we have this request, this kind of, let's say, a high ecclesiastical theological request, then a line is not something, existence of lines is not something that simplifies icon. It makes it, it makes it actually much more complicated than other ways of art. I mean, it's actually the attitude that naturalistic art is more intelligible or more let's say more heavier to render. It's simply naive attitude. It's actually the different kind of different way of thinking which projects to the painting surface. Then line is not something which makes it easier.
Yes.
It simply makes you think in different way and actually makes you think more. If you really want to give something ecclesiastical to let's say to make something to do something for church, for example, if you are pious, then
Yeah.
it's not enough simply to to trace the lines from some other iconographer, whether medieval or contemporary one. So this introduces the thinking and learning to a process. This is what I wanted. This is what maybe from where we can start to develop our aesthetical ideas.
Mihai, you have something in mind?
Yes, I know. I'll just put a start step for the discussion. The line is of relation of the line between the line between themselves, the lines. Okay, it's of huge importance because lines they do mean movement.
Yes.
They do express. They are equivalent of movement on the surface and also of time. Because movement, moving, it's also time. So rendering or organizing lines on the surface, it's in direct relationship with the ecclesiology and also all the content of the image and
That's
the way it connects with the viewer.
Yeah, and that's a very important nuance to keep in mind, because if line creates the relationship between entities in the representation and with the viewer, and is also a means by which you introduce energy or life or movement, just dealing with those complexities like Todor is bringing up. It's not a simple thing at all. You have to, when you're wanting to actually creatively engage with the icon, you have to enter a mode of thinking that is very intentional in what it is that you're doing with how you're treating the line. You're interpreting, you're conceptualizing, you're communicating ideas from your ecclesial mindset, from your experience in church life. And so you're embodying that experience in the linear structure and movement. That, I think, in a way, is perhaps, and this is a topic that we don't need to get into necessarily, but I think that is where the icon relates to some degree to aspects of the development of abstract painting in the 20th century. Because there is a sense in which just the aesthetic formal vehicle itself could in and of itself communicate something higher than itself. It has the capacity to communicate not just a segment of reality or in a naturalistic sense, but it actually has the capacity to communicate feeling and sentiment that could either be in alignment with the ecclesial ethos or it could not. And to me, that's like a dimension that it's the hardest thing to address, because when do you make a the distinction? All right, this one is really in accord with the ecclesial mind, and this one is not. But in any case, that's another topic. But I like the idea of engaging in the act of icon painting with those functions clearly in mind. If you don't have them in your mind clearly as what it is that you're dealing with, as your material, as your conceptual material, then you're not engaging creatively. So other than the line bringing out movement, what other functions could we say the line accomplishes in Byzantine painting?
Line must be a color.
but
that's very basic. That's very basic. What I mean that when you draw a line, it's not just a line. Line is just the limit of a color form. So the line must have such qualities, so must not separate things, but join things. That's important. That's why when the outlines in the color forms must not be very, let's say, must not be very dark, not very far from the color. Otherwise, the line, it's a break. It's a break and actually destroys the main goal of iconography, which is the synthesis. It's the composition of things and not the distinction of things. So the basic quality of line must be this, that should be color by itself, close enough to color, but far enough so to have a distinction, but have at the same time sense of unity.
Yeah.
And in order the line to have these qualities, the line by itself has to have colors qualities. I mean that must not be just a single straight line. Should have tones inside, have a development, should have volume inside. Otherwise, it's a dead line. And since it's a dead line, it's a sharp thing that cuts the surface.
Yeah.
And we don't want that.
Then it's only a mental thing. When it's a dead line, that's a pure projection of thought. I mean, only it is the black and white thought. It is not what I said. It is not the ecclesiastical thought. It's a pure theory. It's without color or without its inner life, I would say, if it's a dead line, if it's separating, actually.
Yeah.
This is a categorical machine, machinery.
Yeah.
Category making categories. It's not the unity. Though it has. I would add here, line actually should be at the same time distincting, but not dividing.
Yeah.
It makes entities different, but it should this is what we said at the beginning, but it should not divide them. This is what George just said, and I think this is actually something like theological concept of inseparable union. I mean, this is inseparable and undividable and unmixable union of entities. This is a parallel to this theological concept. So
Now,
this is against what George says, I think.
Can we talk about some features? What could we, if we were to give specific characteristics of the Byzantine, the use of Byzantine line, the features of this line in icon painting, what properties are more conducive for the line to attain to its function? What are we looking for? What quality of line that you've already started with this, Todor? Like you're saying that the line should have, and Kordis, you're already talking about this too. The line should have some degree of capacity to separate, but not to completely cut off, like to be too schematic or too dry in its abstraction. It has to also have a unitive dimension. It should help to synthesize the composition. I think another thing that we could add to that is clarity of execution. It shouldn't be a muddled line. It should have some I mean, of course, I mean, depending on where you are in the form, right? I mean, but in terms of like the intent, there should be an intent, a clear intent behind what it is that you should be able to read. Getting back to what was said before, you should be able to read clearly what the line is trying to communicate in their overall arrangement.
I think that these are, let's say, I would call these secondary qualities.
Okay.
There is a primary quality, and which is the source from which all other qualities, come from. And I believe that the primary quality should be the capacity of line to be related. That's a basic thing. Every line should be able to be related to everything else.
Yes.
For example, if we have just a broken line, very harsh line, this line cannot be related, for example, with a curved line. It's something that is opposed to every, a curved thing. So immediately we have something in our icon that it's, I would say, improper, because we have something there that cannot be reconciled. So whatever we do, we cannot be able to achieve this sense of unity. So every line, everywhere in the icon must be able to be related to every other line, So based on that, now we can come and just describe secondary qualities, which is, first of all, this what you said, that clarity. Clarity means what? Must be a fine line, not broken line, because if it's broken, it cannot be related. It's pretty simple. It's obscure, it's like having personalities that are not, I would say, clear personalities. They don't know what they want. They cannot move. They cannot participate in community. That's the thing.
Does this then, George, relate to the use of the composite line in the Byzantine icon? Because the composite line, it already, it's based on its relationality to other lines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a synthesis by itself.
Yes.
Line, just one line, the composition by itself. Yeah.
Right. Can I add a little bit? I was just thinking that having this role on being sometimes on the edge, or having the role of being maybe sometimes the darkest or the lightest part of some part, we often could say that the lines are applied at the very end. So technically we speak, we start with the local areas, but the line is something which an artist, iconographer, is supposedly drawing or applying or, I don't know, writing at the very, very end. And supposedly, at least from what we see on the old models, very often it is like a conclusion of all the forms which are under it, like the shadow. If the line is the darkest shadow, means it's the most expressive thing on all the area it's posed. If we are talking about the outlines, this line would include in itself the suppressed depth of the figure, which could have in some realistic space. And we're talking about the highlights, the same thing. The line or the lightest highlight, which can be done as a line, is the most expressive part of the highlight and bearing most of the information which can be given by this or that part of the painting process. So it's the very conclusion, is the essence of what an artist wanted to say in this part or that part.
I think you could expand that into the various stages of the process involves different treatment of the line nuance. You know, for example, like there is the structuring of the composition in the beginning with you know, coming with a totality, a synthetic totality with the structure of lines. Then you block in the color fields based on the distinctions that you've made with the line. And then within that, you begin to define in various degrees the nuance of lines and their relationships throughout. And like you're saying, and then finally making those final assertions to bring the effect to its climax and power, in which would meet, the climax would presuppose the most effective means by which the image projects towards the viewer and a communion is achieved. Perhaps.
Yes, no, I'm totally with you. Yes, George.
Yeah,
what?
I'm not sure. I think that all lines in, let's say, all traditional icons have same qualities. It's a different thing. What you're talking about, it's a matter of tones and light. It's not a matter of quality of line. I'm not sure, because even the outlines or the highlights, which are closed forms, all right, so they have outline, the lines are clearer and have same qualities, just as lines, all right? Of course, it's in different place, and you know, the highlights look that they are more strong, but it's not the quality of line that gives this impression. I think that it's come just because it is the lighter part of the icon, just that.
They have very different function, actually. I mean, the outlines are outlining the form. The accents are making, let's say, the form. They're pushing the form out. So,
right.
Yeah, but qualities are the same. We don't have in all the icons. We don't have, let's say, fade or broken outlines since it's back, or atmospheric line, because it's at the back. We don't have that.
Yeah. No, I'm just adding that we have to think in different way about accents and about outlines. It's not the same thing. But what I want to repeat once again, I want to repeat what George said, which I think is extremely important in contemporary context, is that line has to be thought about as a color. It has to have a color. This is what will bring us to the next, let's say, expressive step of the icon, which is its colors. You know, this is what makes the unity of all pictorial elements. We can't think about any element without thinking about other elements.
Yes.
This is why, you know, when you put the brush stroke with all of its qualities, it has also to has its own color. It is not simply a drawing of a pencil, which creates two parts of the composition. It is a coloristic quality. I would like to share one image which might be inspiring. I think this is essentially important for contemporary icon painting because, as Father Silouan said, contemporary icon painters often stuck to this, you know, precise outlines to make them very, very, very disciplined, to make same lines, and we get naive art. I would like to share something which will make quite a different image on this. I don't know. Do you see it now?
We start seeing something. Yes, we do see it.
Yes.
Yes.
A really great masterpiece, which we have already seen a part of in one of previous sessions. So here we can clearly see that color, that line has its own color, every single one of them, and it's very, very clearly defined. And this is how and yet it delineates everything very precisely. And of course, it has this extreme sophistication of different kinds of brush strokes, which now brings us, of course, to the aesthetic subjects. But it has a very, very huge, let's say, very huge dynamics between dark and light lines, between thick and thin lines, between long and short lines, and it clearly shows that every line has its own color. It cannot be even thought about without its color. You know, even if you put a dark line, even if you put a black line, okay, some styles do have black lines, but in this case, this black becomes a color. This black makes an impact on the final result. In here, of course, we don't have. This is a good example because we don't have actually really dark lines. Every line has its own color, even these very, very light and thin lines on the white garment. So this is maybe a good example of what we were speaking about, and I think this is an essential thing for you know, for contemporary iconography. This is, as Father said justly, quite a problematic moment.
How do we address that? How do we, because I grant that the part of the problem is that there isn't a mechanism of education to basically train. Okay, I'm speaking from my own ignorance and my isolation from what you have accessible in your countries. You know, because you do have programs of training iconographers, but my conundrum has been, my difficulty has been in, you know, when people become interested in iconography, either they have no training whatsoever in visual art, or they come from a background that is not in any form related to the tradition of icon painting. So how do we then train the capacity to be able to perceive line outside of the naturalistic representational mode of training. You know, we are not, I mean, perhaps there is a place for the use of plaster casts and drawing from you know, plaster casts and then drawing from the figure and you know, drawing from objects to as preparatory stages, and I think that's useful too. That's part of the way I learn how to do things. But nevertheless, you need to go through a change of mind to be able to perceive what, you know, we're talking about and what Todor is pointing out. And the interesting thing is that after you see a masterpiece like that, and you look at Florentine draftsmen from like the 15th century, you begin to realize there is a universal thought going on here in a way of how form is developed. It's done according to different principles, but they're not completely unrelated. And so, anyway, so I think that's perhaps something that we could address. But before we do that, what I want to ask as a final thought online is what George has called the transverse principle, or the capacity of line to function in such a way to project the form out towards the viewer. Can you talk a little bit about that, George?
Well, it's just a matter of it's always just a way of thinking. Lines should be drawn this way in order for the objects to be projected outside the surface towards spectator. That means that every line should move towards this direction. And in order this to be achieved, lines basically must be curved lines. We cannot use straight lines because a straight line, it's by definition, is a flat thing, so cannot project anything. So we have to have curved lines, and basically most of lines should be curved and down, because this is the movement. It's from the surface towards spectator. A line that goes up actually goes back, so draws to an independent, you know, pictorial space. So that's a basic principle, but this principle, it's very difficult to be applied, you know, because you have specific objects, you have specific things. So you have to be able to handle all lines and to have all these projections all around. It's a complicated process. It has to do with synthesis or composition, you know. It's the same word. It has to do with position and a relationship between things. And the final goal of this is to have all things to be united in Christ, and to be united, you know, themselves. So it's a complicated process, and definitely we cannot see line as independent thing from color. Line and color they go together, so we cannot just separate them. We have to we see both together, and their function it's you know, simultaneous, definitely.
And the issue of feeling, this sounds probably a bit too you know, irrelevant when it comes to the icon, because usually the icon is considered to be something that has nothing to do with self-expression. And so anything that has to do with emotion or feeling is considered to be marginal to the purpose of the icon, which is to be a prayerful image. Nevertheless, all of us know
Yeah.
that when, depending on the mark that you make, the mark will have different qualities.
Yes.
And that will be translated into the overall effect of the image. Now, can you comment on, Mihai, how do you deal with the issue of line as it relates to feeling? Do you even think about that in the process of your articulating an image?
I believe it's of huge importance also, the precise quality that each of us put in its lines. I believe it's very similar with the handwriting. Mm-hmm. Although we all write in the same language, each one's text, it looks very different without very conscious action. I believe that an honest painter, which would look to organize its line in order to give unity and to give the proper movement inside the composition, will in time he will put enough personality in its lines without willing to. I believe that it's very much connected with each one's person, with inner. The personality of.
Todor, I got a question for you. I think this is also related to Philip, because Philip and Todor, your forms have an abstract quality that are very unique. That if I was to try to attempt the painting like the kind of painting that you do, it would not work, because I would be lying, because like Mihai is saying, I wouldn't be true to myself. Okay, so nevertheless, there is a dimension in your work that I think is there is an intentional dimension as well as a personal dimension. Okay, how do you find the balance between that? For example, if I try to do a form that is not so academic and precise, and and I prefer to do a representation that is more naive in its effect, in the way that it's put together, is more childlike. You could either do that honestly or not. I mean, and sometimes you see people attempting to do that and you realize they're just faking it, But I look at the use, for example, of some of the Romanesque forms that Philip uses in his studio with his wife, and the way they're managing those forms, they feel like they're internalized and they're coming out as a fresh interpretation, not just an aping of another form. The same thing with Todor. Todor, your forms are very personal, but at the same time, they look somewhat naive. But I know that they're not naive, because you're making very clear choices. How do you manage that?
Well, maybe the previous question is connected with this. I mean, the question of feelings. Okay, this is a strange word. It is used very much in popular culture, but nevertheless, I don't think that ecclesiastical art or even theology, the ecclesiastical thought, is deprived of feelings. On the contrary, I don't think. I mean, I don't think anything can be deprived of feelings. It's actually the naive attitude. It's not possible to across the street without feelings. So I don't know. I mean, this is an immense part of human nature. We like it or not. We can say, maybe we can say we don't like this because we don't control this, or we don't know what to do with this. I mean, but this is what is a part of us, as well as our body. You know, in the Middle Ages, or I don't know, in late antiquity, maybe they had a problem with their bodies. You know, they said, okay, the soul is much more important than the body, so let's work on our soul and neglect the body. But it's not the way it functions in church. I think church needs the entire person. So feelings. I think that actually what artists, the important, even I would dare to say the essential part of icon, which artist does, is to give his feelings. I don't know how to show this. I don't know how to put my fingers on what are feelings. But actually, we have let's say the tradition. We have the iconography. We have the content of icon. You know, we know what we should paint. We know whom we paint. We know the events. We know the theological concepts we paint. We know a lot of things that we paint. And okay, we can change even some elements of this language. We can make, but as I said, we cannot change entire language. The language can be changed only a little bit, you know, as the speaking language. It changes hard. What painter makes, what painter does, I think, okay, this is my private attitude, what painter does is that he gives a life to what he represents. He makes it, he gives, I would say, okay, it is very hard to explain. He gives his energy. He gives, I don't know, he gives his body. He gives his blood. He gives his feelings. This is what is what person makes. You know, to make thing alive. So this is somebody does it in more expressive way. Somebody does it in more delicate way. We differ in this. Or we can say, as Mihai said, this might be our handwriting, but this handwriting, without, you know, we cannot communicate, for example, without our bodies. It's not possible. You know, even in here, we don't communicate. Okay, we communicate with voices, with hands, with bodies, with everything. So it's the same in there. We give a body to the icon. You know, we give we make it, you know, make it a material thing, and we try to make it alive. So this is where feelings come. I don't say that we only have feelings, of course.
Right.
Of course, I'm not saying this.
Yeah.
Maybe we can't say that the feelings are the primary element of icon. But I think that this is a very important element, which cannot be separated.
It's unavoidable. George, you had something to say?
Yeah. I would say that, okay, we don't disagree that you know, we are, you know, specific people, you know, persons. We whatever we do, it's something personal, but we cannot say that our feelings, and actually this is something that must be clarified. What do we mean feelings? It's complicated.
That's true.
I know it's
and apart from that, we cannot say that this part of the icon must be the structure of the icon. The basic, the essential part of the icon cannot be that. Definitely, this personal touch must exist. It's unavoidable, actually. Whatever we do will be there anyway, in any case.
But don't you think, I think that there is a difference between painting creatively the icon with the acknowledgement and acceptance of that role being an inextricable part of it and denying that. And I think in the problem of a lot of the contemporary training and workshops that you find out there has an attitude that looks at it in a very simplistic level, where it's you're just basically duplicating. You're not investing yourself in it.
Right, just copy forms, but
yes.
It's not that, but it's not also the other extreme.
It's not all. I just wanted to make to clarify this exactly because of what.
Right. Basically, what we do is public art. It's ecclesiastical art. So basically, that must have specific characteristics in order to have this function. And part of this must be our personal experience. But this experience cannot be just, our temporary sentiments. If I am sad, where I am painting a resurrection, cannot do this in a net because I'm sad or I am depressed. No.
Yes.
Yes.
Anyway,
our personal experience of life definitely will be there, but we have to be very controlled. And I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not thinking about sentiments.
Yes.
I agree definitely, and anyhow, this is why I insist in this, because if we agree on about what we spoke in previous six sessions, then we actually already have the structure of the icon. We already have its function. We already have its ecclesiastical place. We already have its. We have already structured a lot of it. So what we add something like we can call this spirit. We have everything. And then you give a breath to it.
That's. I was thinking about that same when you said that. I was thinking about that example.
It's not the first step, but it is not. It is a step that cannot be denied. It cannot be expelled. Without it, something is missing. I mean, we can compare this with different things. We can compare this, for example, with skin. Of humans. Okay, skin is not our central organ. The heart is our central organ. Our mind is also very important. But also without skin, something is missing. We need all the parts.
Right.
This is maybe a good comparison because when you say feelings, it always drives us to the sentiments and to the extreme feelings and to the movies, and this makes things too prosaic.
This you brought the word sentiment, and I wanna bring up an interesting relationship of what we're discussing to Indian aesthetics, because in India they have this theory of rasa, and this theory of rasa is this notion of like the flavor of the form, or it comes from actually the theories developed around performance art, but eventually it basically took hold of like music and painting, and it became a basic structure of Indian aesthetics. And they have, I think, some earlier manuscripts have 8 rasas and some have 9, but generally they accept 9 rasas. And the rasa is in the Sanskrit, I think it's you could interpret it as juice or the essence or the flavor of a thing, or in a broader sense, the sentiment that comes from the aesthetic experience. And so what's interesting about their theory is that they have designated more systematic ways of addressing the issue of emotion or sentiment, because they have, for example, the comic sentiment, the erotic sentiment, the blissful sentiment, And so you don't have to harden them so much that like you could only depict or use one sentiment for each picture, but you could find the predominant sentiment in a given image. And I think that could be a useful way for us to deal with the issue of feeling and sentiments as we work on an icon, because evidently we're not going to be imbuing an image with a sentiment of the warrior sentiment, or like, you know, the warring sentiment, or the erotic sentiment. That's not what the function of the icon is for. But there is a predominance of the blissful element in the icon, it seems to me, insofar as it is meant for you to be in communion with the saint and for it to actually contribute for the prayer in the liturgical experience. And so, but there are other dynamics. Like, for example, you could say in some of the depictions of the baptism of the Lord and some of the depictions of the Lord's entry into the Jerusalem, that you find comic sentiments in it. In the peripheral, when you have the children playing in the tree, or the children unclothing themselves and jumping into the water. So you have the capacity to say, yes, that segment of the icon is treating this specific sentiment. So that gives me a parameter into which I could then imbue it with my interpretation of that specific, you know, topic that they're dealing with my own way of doing it, that fits within the strictures and the function of the icon without getting carried away.
It's a big issue, Father. It's a question. What's exactly the function of these, let's say, you know, secondary elements in the icon? Is it just the expression of, let's say, iconographers, you know, sentiments or feelings, or they have another function? It's a question.
Yes.
It's a question.
Yeah, Philip. Oh, we're running out of time?
I don't know. I'm just afraid you're making it too long. There are so many wonderful things we may discuss, but we probably should stop at this moment.
Yes.
I want to answer just the second question. Do we have 2 minutes?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Let's say this naive element. I don't. It's very huge topic for me also. I won't go too far now. Maybe we can leave it for some other discussion. But I think that this, let's say, naive element or childish element, or we can call it a flavor of childishness. This element, I think, exists throughout the entire Byzantine art, in my opinion. In more or in bigger, in higher or lower amount. You know, it can be found in very high masterpieces like Hosius Lucas from Phokida. It's totally, this is quite a I would say childish art. Art with a lot of childish elements. And I don't find these masters that they could be very naive. But not only this art, you know, we can say that elements of childishness exist throughout all this Macedonian epoch, or even through a Comnenian epoch. You know, even in the art of Neresy, which is very high art, there are some elements of being naive. And let me just add this.
Todor, it's a big issue. No, I think that it's good to stop over here, and maybe we can discuss this in a separate. It's another thing. It's a good topic. Big issue. It's a big topic, very big topic.
Yeah. Let's leave it for some of the next sessions.
Yeah, but that's good, because we have already two topics. One is the peripheral elements in icons, such as the ones we discussed with baptism and the entry to the temple. What function they serve in those icons, and also the issue of the naive elements in the various schools, which I think is a very important thing that has to be addressed because, in any case, we'll go into it later, but it is a very important topic. So that's it for today, folks. So I think did you stop recording or did you?
Not yet,
Okay.
but I can do it now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I stop recording. This was the 7th session of Iconography conference online.
Yeah.
Very good. So
stopped recording 1 and stopped recording